I knew something was off the moment Martin Belrose laughed during my presentation to the board. Not the polite, I'm listening but don't care kind of laugh. No. This was the full, you're obsolete and don't know it yet chuckle, right in the middle of me walking them through Dalton Core's updated SOC2 gap mitigation. 6.5 years I'd carried this company's compliance from duct-taped file cabinets to a fully encrypted multi-layer framework, my framework, and now this startup prince from Stanford was smiling like I'd handed him a paper map in a GPS world. Wait, are you seriously still using spreadsheets? He asked, blinking like a Labrador that had just discovered sarcasm. I didn't answer. I didn't have to, because if he'd read even a single one of our updated audit protocols, he'd know there wasn't a spreadsheet in sight. What he was calling spreadsheets was a zero-trust policy grid I'd authored, peer-reviewed, version-locked, and hashed through a token that bore exactly one name. Mine. Officer ID 01723. By the way, if you're into stories where the quiet one doesn't just survive, but builds the trap they all fall into, go ahead and subscribe and give this a like. It really does help the team tell more stories like this one. Now, back to Martin. He talked fast, waved his hands like the whiteboard was an enemy to be conquered, and used the word legacy like it meant mold. I was the legacy. Never mind that regulators never once dinged us, that we'd passed 3 surprise audits clean, that our entire vendor policy structure was now the backbone of our largest contracts. Martin's mind was already racing ahead to something newer, flashier, probably built by his friends in a glass tower with a kombucha fridge. His first internal memo came 2 days later: modernize or stall. He meant outsource, and he meant me. The new initiative was called C3, Centralized Compliance Contracting. They were bringing in a firm named Caliber Trust. I knew the name. High flash, low teeth, run by one of Martin's Stanford buddies who'd once had a TED Talk about disruption in regulatory friction, which is Silicon Valley for we never got sued bad enough yet. In private, I flagged the continuity requirement baked into federal guidelines. Some sections still required legacy officer sign-off. If not for legality, then at least for traceability. Martin waved it off. That's what indemnity insurance is for. He had no idea that every single one of our 198 core policies was hash-locked to a system I'd built from scratch, using a root certificate tied to my personal identity token, a certificate that, by design, could not be cloned or transferred without a notarized signature and my biometric approval. I never documented that in plain English. Why would I? They never asked. So I kept showing up, kept running approvals, kept watching Caliber Trust fumble its onboarding while I quietly patched their gaps from the shadows. It was like watching toddlers juggle knives. If the knives were $88 million in cross-border data compliance liability. But I knew it was coming. They weren't going to thank me. They were going to erase me. 3 weeks later, HR slid a white envelope across my desk. The director couldn't meet my eyes. You've been great, but the CEO wants to modernize, she said. I nodded, smiled, took the envelope. Inside, 2 weeks severance and a generic thank you letter. No mention of intellectual property, no mention of cert transfer, no legal exit checklist. They didn't ask for my token, didn't even know it existed. I handed her my badge, walked out with nothing but a coat and a tote bag, said nothing. But inside, I was already smiling, because they hadn't fired a person. They'd fired the root key to their own compliance kingdom. He called it an efficiency crusade, like we were storming medieval castles and not handling frameworks that stood between us and million-dollar fines. Martin stood in the center of the conference room like a venture-funded preacher, pacing back and forth in his slim-fit suit, preaching the gospel of agility and decentralized oversight models. The PowerPoint behind him looked like it had been made by someone who confused regulatory policy with a TEDx pitch. We're partnering with Caliber Trust for end-to-end compliance optimization, he beamed. It's time to modernize and scale. I didn't flinch. I just stared at the bullet point that said, Legacy Systems Phase Out, 90 Days. Caliber Trust. I knew the name because I'd flagged their last data processing memo as concerning during a due diligence call 2 years ago. Their public filings had language so vague it might as well have been written by an intern who once skimmed a Wikipedia page on GDPR. And now they were going to own our regulatory backbone? Because Martin shared a dorm room with the founder in '09? Don't worry, he added, smiling too hard. This doesn't mean we're erasing what you built. We're just translating it to something scalable. No offense, of course. I nodded slowly, then raised my hand like I had in every compliance review for the last 6 years. Calm, patient, clinical. There are regulatory thresholds that require continuity of oversight: federal disclosures, cross border contracts, state level health compliance. Some sections are bound to the original compliance officer, not the entity. You'll need a formal certificate transfer, not just a vendor handshake. Martin looked over at me like I'd just told him we needed to fax something. That's what indemnity insurance is for, he said with a smirk. We'll absorb the risk if we have to. No, I thought, you won't. Because what he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that half of Dalton Core's compliance documents weren't just PDFs or Word files sitting on a shared drive. They were part of a closed-loop integrity structure I'd built from the ground up. Every policy, every approval, every signed template was hashed and version locked using a certificate key tied directly to my ID. Officer 01723. Not IT, not legal, me. The whole system had a failsafe. If my certificate was revoked without a valid transfer, the documents didn't just lose authorization. They became read-only, locked, irreversible. Like old stone tablets, no one could chisel into again. But nobody asked. Not legal, not IT, not even the transition consultant from Caliber Trust who strolled into my office a week later and asked where we kept the compliance macros. I pointed to the cloud directory and smiled. They're version controlled. Just make sure your permissions are up to date. He grinned, thanked me, and left. I waited until he was out of earshot before logging into the framework. Quietly, I updated the internal certificate log to reflect a single, unspoken truth. My ID key was now flagged retired, not transferred, not reassigned, just expired. The countdown had begun, and they didn't even know they were standing on a minefield. The envelope was warm, like someone had been nervously holding it too long before bringing it in. I could tell the moment HR stepped into my office that it was happening. She didn't say hello, just gave this polite, brittle smile like we were strangers in an elevator. Then she sat down in the guest chair across from me, legs crossed, fingers fidgeting with the edge of the folder. "You've been incredible," she started. The pause after "been" told me everything. "But Martin feels it's time to modernize the structure. Compliance 2.0, he calls it." I just looked at her. She couldn't hold my gaze. "Your last day is today. Access ends at close of business." No Martin, no handshake, not even a Zoom call from his standing desk at HQ. After 6.5 years of holding this place together through 3 vendor overhauls, 2 SEC inquiries, and a complete digital transformation I personally mapped and executed, this was it. A paper envelope and a ghost of a compliment. I nodded. Took the envelope without opening it. No need. I already knew it wouldn't mention a thing about intellectual ownership or systems transfer. No questions about the digital framework I'd constructed. No audit walkthrough. No chain of custody meeting. Just an assumption that once the badge beeped red, I'd vanish like a spreadsheet left open too long. "You'll still have health coverage through the end of the month," she added, as if that would somehow dull the insult. I reached into my bag, pulled out my badge, and placed it gently on the desk between us. "You sure you've got everything you need?" I asked quietly. She blinked. "Yes, I think so." That was the moment. That exact phrase, "I think so," is when I knew they hadn't even realized what they were missing. I smiled once, not warmly, just enough to make her uncomfortable. Then I turned, walked out of my office for the last time, and hit the elevator button with a kind of peace I didn't expect to feel. Not anger, not even satisfaction. Just clarity. They'd made a mistake. A clean one. No gray area, no argument I'd ever need to have. By the time I got to the parking garage, I pulled up the internal compliance admin dashboard from my phone. Just muscle memory at this point. It still let me in, of course. My token had elevated clearance until midnight that night. They hadn't revoked it, hadn't even thought to. I tapped a few lines into the certificate ledger. One field, Officer ID 01723. Status, expired. That was it. Not deleted, not handed over, just retired. Without that certificate, the policy framework couldn't be modified, only read, not even with admin rights. The digital hash locked every version in place unless signed by the originating officer, which now didn't exist. They assumed I was just the person who filed things. They never once asked how things got validated. Never traced the compliance reports back to the actual infrastructure holding them in place. Never knew that the root key wasn't stored in a shared drive or backed up on the company server. It was on a biometric token I carried on a keychain, which I left in my glove compartment and drove away with. No legal battle, no outburst, no burned bridges, just a door sliding shut behind me as quietly as it had opened all those years ago. And a system that now answered to no one. 2 days after they walked me out, I brewed coffee in my kitchen and opened my laptop out of habit. I didn't log into anything, I didn't need to. I just sat there, imagining the exact moment Calibre Trust's junior consultant tried to push their first streamlined vendor policy suite into the framework. I could practically hear the click of the upload button, then the silence, then the first confused curse, because the files didn't stick. They never would. Every single policy, 198 of them, snapped right back to the last authorized version like elastic pulled too far. The shiny new updates just vanished, replaced by the locked originals I'd validated months ago. The signature fields returned an error no one in that building had ever seen before. Unsigned. Invalid digital authority. And that wasn't some glitch they could whisper to a T about. That was the system telling them the truth they'd ignored for months. There was no digital authority, not without me. Calibre Trust tried again, and again, and again. Drag and drop, manual upload, even a bulk override attempt. I later heard someone spent an hour rebooting the system because they assumed it was stuck in legacy mode. Legacy mode. If only they knew how poetic that sounded. But nothing changed, nothing moved, nothing saved. Because the moment my certificate fell into an expired state, the framework didn't collapse. It protected itself. Every template in that structure defaulted to read-only, locked to the last authenticated signature. Mine. That was the entire point of the architecture. No unauthorized edits, no ghost authors, no quiet rewrites to please a new CEO's friend. And since nobody transferred the certificate, since nobody asked for the token, since nobody thought a foundational officer might have foundational access, well, the system simply obeyed me by not obeying anyone else. Around noon, the regulators received Dalden's attempted quarterly policy update. Or rather, they received a packet of incomplete documentation with mismatched signatures, missing approvals, and a dozen automated alerts stamped across the metadata. The framework had flagged the entire submission as non-compliant before it even left the server. I could picture it perfectly. Someone in that glass building refreshing their inbox, expecting a clean confirmation, and instead getting a bright red banner that read, "Documents invalid, verification failed." That cold rush of confusion, then irritation, then fear. Someone would call IT, it would call legal. Legal would call Calibre Trust. Calibre Trust would blame legacy constraints. And somewhere in that growing storm, someone would realize the one question they should have asked before firing me: who actually controls this system? The answer was already echoing through their frantic meetings, even if they didn't speak it out loud. Not them, not anymore. The cracks weren't loud. They were quiet, hairline fractures at first, an upload that wouldn't stick, a sign-off that wouldn't validate, a regulator requesting clarification that no one could confidently give. But quiet cracks have a way of spreading fast when pressure builds, and inside Dalden Core, pressure was the only thing they had left. By the 5th day, the chaos had sharpened from confusion to desperation. Legal had been pulling 14-hour shifts trying to make sense of a system they thought was just an accessory to documentation, not the spine of it. They dug through version logs, internal memos, vendor Q&A transcripts, anything they could grab to explain why nothing worked. Then someone finally opened the sealed exit packet I'd signed. Clause 4.3b. Tucked 3 pages deep into the legal boilerplate, past the non-disparagement and asset return section, past the indemnity waiver no one reads. Retired compliance architecture, unless formally transferred via notarized certificate exchange, remains the intellectual and operational property of the officer of record. There it was, clear as daylight, legally reviewed, board approved, and countersigned 5 years ago when I first built the system. At the time, I'd insisted on that clause because the framework wasn't just a folder structure. It was a live compliance engine. If they wanted it without me, they had to transfer it properly. Not deactivate and forget it. Not throw it at a contractor and hope for the best. Not pretend Calibre Trust could slap a new skin on it and call it theirs. No notarized certificate exchange, no transfer. And who was the officer of record? Me. Still. But it got worse. For them. Just below clause 4.3b, they found the part nobody remembered reviewing because it had been added as an appendix after final board sign-off, subclause I-VO. Any policy modification made without verified certificate authorization will trigger ghost authorship detection and notify appropriate regulatory bodies per risk category protocol. Translation: the moment Caliber Trust started monkeying with templates using unverified credentials, the system flagged those actions as suspicious and logged them under ghost authorship, the internal term I used for unauthorized compliance edits. That log didn't just stay local. It was set to ping federal regulators in any case where unauthorized modifications occurred within 60 days of a policy recertification window. Guess what window they were in? The system had already filed the notice. Automatically. No alert, no warning. Just a quiet submission with a detailed report, time-stamped and signed with the framework's last verified credential, mine. And the regulators? They don't like ghost authors. They don't like incomplete filings. They really don't like when a company tries to rewrite policies and backdate the signatures using third-party contractors with no formal officer designation, especially when the last officer of record hasn't signed a transfer form, especially when that officer hasn't even been contacted, which was the next realization that hit Dalden's legal team like a dropped safe. I hadn't lifted a single finger. No emails, no threats, no messages. I hadn't posted on LinkedIn or called a single contact in the building. I hadn't sent a cease and desist or disputed my termination. I had just left. And the system I built kept doing exactly what it was always designed to do: maintain compliance. At all costs, including compliance with its own governance chain, including calling out tampering. Every control they thought was off was still active. Every shortcut they thought they'd taken, flagged. Every policy they thought they'd modernized, now evidence in a federal compliance investigation. They didn't just skip a step. They skipped the one step that locked the entire framework down in the first place. And now the walls were starting to close. The alert came through just after midnight on a Tuesday. Caliber Trust's dashboard, usually full of polite green check marks and boilerplate reminders, lit up with one line no consultant wants to see blinking in orange. Compliance audit request scheduled. 21 days, no panic button, no loud sirens, just a quiet official sentence sitting there like a loaded gun on the desk. Automatic, procedural, unpreventable. My framework had done its job. The audit wasn't discretionary, it was hardwired. When the system logs 3 or more policy discrepancies tied to ghost authorship within a 30-day window, it flags the integrity breach and begins a countdown. That part wasn't even hidden. It was in the original system documentation. Section 8.5. Trigger conditions for federal integrity notice. They'd signed off on it during rollout. The kicker? Nobody at Dalden or Caliber Trust had bothered to read the full audit flow. They still thought this was fixable, that some executive handshake or policy rewrite could quiet it down before regulators started sniffing around, that someone could just pick up a phone, call the right contact, and make it all go away. But the framework didn't ask for favors. It just followed protocol. The first real consequence landed when Dalden's third-party vendor, Ravex Systems, quietly pulled out of an expanded compliance deal they'd been prepping since Q4. Ravex's legal team, which had reviewed the public bulletin like hawks, flagged the phrase "designation under review" and immediately escalated to their general counsel. Within 48 hours, the deal was dead. No press release. Just a short internal memo. Due to increasing compliance ambiguity at Dalden Core Technologies, Ravex will not proceed with integration. Translation: your risk profile's now radioactive. The Caliber Trust team didn't even know what hit them. One of their leads, a woman named Eleni, reached out to the framework's help portal, the one I'd built, asking for escalation protocol on premature audit flagging. The auto response she got back was simple. Protocol not premature, log discrepancies, 14, ghost author signature violations, 7, certificate transfer detected, 0. And beneath that, in grayscale, officer of record ID 01723, status, retired, non-transferable. They tried calling the hotline. It rang. It even offered support options, but the only credential that could trigger a rollback or reset, mine, and I was no longer employed. Meanwhile, the regulator bulletin went public, not flashy, just one line in a PDF update quietly posted on the agency's transparency portal. Dalden Core Technologies, compliance designation, under review. That phrase, under review, sent their legal department into triage mode because it meant the company was now flagged in every procurement system, risk index, and contract approval process they were connected to. Existing vendors would hold payments, prospective partners would stall deals, investors would start asking for independent verification. And all of it was happening without a single move from me. No social post, no lawsuit, no interview. I hadn't filed a report, called a hotline, or sent a warning. I was drinking coffee in my living room, watching a documentary about mountain goats, but the framework I left behind, it didn't care if I'd moved on. It just kept doing the one thing I built it to do: protect the truth. And now the truth was this: they had fired their only source of compliance legitimacy, and the entire ecosystem was beginning to notice. The first missed call came at 7:46 a.m., Martin's name blinking on the screen like a ghost trying to claw its way back through a locked door. No voicemail. Just a second call an hour later, then silence. By lunchtime, his assistant emailed me directly. Subject line: quick chat? The message was short, informal, and laced with corporate guilt thinly disguised as friendliness. Hi, hope you're well. Martin was hoping to catch up. No pressure, just a quick conversation, nothing formal. Let us know when might work for you. I closed the tab and didn't respond. Let silence speak. I wasn't mad. I wasn't vengeful. I was simply busy. Because while Dalden's board was whiteboarding damage control and their compliance team was Googling retroactive officer transfer, I was on a call with Valencor's chief technology officer, reviewing a deployment schedule for a custom compliance engine I'd been quietly building since February. Yes, February. Before they even fired me, Valencor had approached me privately after one of their board members read a white paper I'd ghostwritten under the Dalden umbrella. They asked who built the policy integrity chain. I said I had. They asked what I'd do with full control. I told them. Now, under a private 3-year contract, I was doing exactly that. Clean slate, better funding, and most importantly, the freedom to refine everything I'd built, without interference from smoothie-chugging CEOs or shortcut-happy consultants. The irony hit public 2 days later when a compliance blog I'd followed for years, Regulametrics, published a quiet expose. Valencor's new compliance engine. Old roots, new reach. They didn't name me, but they didn't have to. The screenshots of the new framework showed enough metadata in the corner for anyone familiar with Dalden's backend to recognize the architecture. It was unmistakable. Same core hash logic, new front end, better modularity, smarter failover triggers. Within hours, LinkedIn lit up. Consultants, vendors, auditors all asking the same thing in different ways. Wait, wasn't that Dalden's? And just like that, the rumor mill kicked into second gear. Dalden didn't respond publicly, but behind closed doors they knew. You could see it in the shift of their tone. Their LinkedIn went dark. Internal recruiters started quietly reactivating old job postings for mid-tier compliance analysts, hoping to cobble together something resembling a team. Meanwhile, Valencor's stock ticked up, not by much, but enough to notice. Their latest client onboarding? Ravex Systems. Yes. That Ravex. The same vendor that had walked away from Dalden after the compliance bulletin went live. They had rerouted their contract to Valencor's doorstep. And guess who reviewed their integration packet? Me. No celebration, no gloating. I didn't post a victory thread or slide into old coworkers' DMs with "told you so." I just approved the file, sent it back, and got on with the day. The shift was quiet, but it was happening. The power didn't explode, it evaporated from Dalden's hands and reformed somewhere else, somewhere I now stood with both feet planted. And Martin, he felt it. I know he did. Not because of the missed calls, but because of what they represented. Panic, cloaked in politeness. They weren't trying to reconnect. They were trying to reel back something they never understood and never truly owned. The room smelled like cold coffee and panic sweat, the kind of sterile tension you only get in a regulatory hearing when everyone realizes they've underestimated the rules and the person who wrote them. Martin sat at the end of the conference table, his usual tan complexion faded under the overhead fluorescence. He was flanked by Dalden's interim general counsel and their CFO, who looked like she hadn't slept in at least 2 days. The federal compliance officer leading the session flipped calmly through the printed report, page by page, pausing only to highlight metadata. They were using hard copies. That alone was telling. No one trusts editable files when the question on the table is criminal negligence. Every policy version reviewed, the lead investigator said, not even looking up, traces back to a single officer ID 01723. He tapped his pen twice on the folder. That's not you, correct, Mr. Belrose? Martin gave a tight, shallow nod. Correct. And no certificate of transfer exists? Silence. The investigator waited. No, Martin finally admitted. The sound of the CFO swallowing was louder than anyone expected. She whispered, barely audible. That's criminal exposure. The investigator didn't reply. He didn't need to. Instead, he placed the report face down and laced his fingers. Dalden Core Technologies is, as of now, retroactively non-compliant for the past 3 fiscal quarters, which places your last vendor certifications, your federal procurement eligibility, and several investor-facing attestations in breach of policy. Martin tried to respond, but nothing came out. His mouth opened, then closed, like a man realizing there's no version of the truth that makes him look competent anymore. So he defaulted to the only thing left: blame. We didn't think she'd actually lock us out, he said softly, almost to himself. The investigator raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? Martin's jaw tightened. The officer, 01723. We assumed once she was gone, the system would move on. The room was dead quiet. No one jumped in to save him. The investigator made a small note on his pad. That was your second mistake, he said. The first was not understanding your own infrastructure. He closed the folder. Hearing suspended pending formal review. Will be issuing a summary notice of violation. Expect correspondence within 5 business days. The lawyers didn't even look at each other. The CFO kept blinking like she was trying not to cry. Martin stayed seated after everyone else stood. His eyes were locked on the seal of the agency stitched into the center of the table, like maybe it would shift or offer him a do-over. But this wasn't Silicon Valley. This was federal regulation, and he just told the truth out loud in front of people who write consequences for a living. He didn't understand the system. He never did. And now, there was no defense, no deflection, no fix. He bet on move fast and replace the old guard, and all he got was a locked system, and the person he fired holding the only key. The final blow didn't come with headlines or scandal. It came buried in a quarterly filing no one outside the investor call read carefully. Just a single footnote on page 37, bottom margin, behind revenue projections and under risk disclosures. Compliance realignment finalized. That was it. No press release, no apology, no grand gesture of accountability from Martin or his board, just the quiet administrative language of defeat. The fine they paid clocked in at $2.8 million, enough to trigger a second round of layoffs, deep enough to crater morale but not dramatic enough to earn sympathy. Their stock dropped 21% in 2 days. It never recovered. And their largest client? Gone. Valencourt signed them mid-month. The transition happened cleanly, without fanfare. I reviewed the transfer documents over a weekend, redlined a few sections, and clicked approve. The client didn't even blink. They were just relieved someone still knew how to build systems that actually held under pressure. Meanwhile, Dalden tried to stabilize with a new compliance hire and a fresh consultant team, but it didn't matter. Every document they touched triggered a legacy metadata alert. Every attempt to rewrite policy from scratch had to contend with the same reality. The old framework was still visible, still verifiable, and it didn't belong to them. They thought erasing the person meant erasing the footprint. But I never needed a spotlight, just a signature line. Officer ID 01723, still embedded in the footer of every policy they'd ever published, still traceable in every regulator archive, still stamped on every vendor contract that hadn't been reissued under new terms. I never filed an appeal, never contacted a journalist, never stood on a stage and told the story. I didn't need to, because the record tells it for me. Every failed upload, every reverted template, every hearing transcript and audit log, they're all part of a truth they can't rewrite. That their system was never built to forget me, and I was never built to be replaceable. So I let the silence settle. Let them stew in the framework they couldn't bend. Let the version logs testify on my behalf. And while they rebuilt, I built forward. not from bitterness, from clarity, because legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what no one else can edit.